Okay, so welcome to KCP community meeting. Today is February 13. Good thing it's not Friday. And I guess KCP is part of CNCF. All these meetings are governed by CNCF Code of Conduct, which boils down to let's be excellent to each other. So we have an agenda today here. And one of the first things we agreed last time is that we're gonna start tracking the attendees in the document. So if you want to be on the list, if you could add yourself to the document, that would save a bit of hassle of me going and trying to find out who's everybody, who is who. So appreciate that. And as always, is there anybody who is new to the call and would want to introduce themselves? I would open floor for this before we jump to official agenda. Going once, going twice. Okay, so we have only one agenda item, which I added last week. So while we go into this, I think it will be more as a heads up, potentially, because we're thinking about bringing change. Feel free to add anything else you want to discuss. Cool. So I can share the screen. So there is a document which is posted in a chat too. So as people who've been around KCP for a longer time, you know about API exports and API bindings being the main contract for API contract between consumer and service provider. And we came up to this use case, which I think is a core to make this extendable in a further, where in example, you want to construct an API like this, where this would become your API schema, but you want to provide certain types which would be referenceable by your API, meaning seed your consumers with certain CRDs or objects to be referred to. And we kind of gave a name for that, it's a virtual resources. So we've been iterating on the API a bit. And one of the proposals how to address this would be to extend an API export, current API export object. And currently we have latest resource schemas, which is a basically a slice of strings, to something more structurized, where it becomes resource schemas named and potentially storage. This is potentially a breaking change in API, but this would give us ability to introduce something like storage layer in the future, and the storage layer could become virtual, potentially enables us to create a medium to reflect the resources in the consumer workspace. The source part, how we're going to do this, like where do we take these, let's say, instance types and reflect them into the customer consumer workspace, is still up to define. But this step would give us enough freedom to start working on this. And as it would be a bit of breaking change in a current schema, we will still want to go through the release, deprecation, mutating basically all the code machinery to enable this. And in the end, from the consumer perspective, not much changing. It's still API binding. Maybe some permission claims would be added. And we were thinking that into the customer workspace, that would be something like aggregated API server, where we just reflect resources into the workspace view. So that, I said, few things are still in the air, but I think we have enough to start working on this until we define the sources. Any questions, concerns on this, comments?
I think this breaking API change is probably a good opportunity to just bump to V1 Alpha 2. Simple as that. If we like do breaking changes, probably a good idea.
Yep.
I'm also still a little like I know it's just like examples, but I really wonder, for example, if like what the, let's say, headline of this resource schema's part of the config should be, because these virtual resources, they don't provide a resource schema, right? So they are strictly speaking just resources, and some of them are backed by a schema, and some of them are backed by virtual endpoints. So we also need to think about the naming there a bit.
So this is why...
Aren't all of them just schemas? That was my expectation, that we use the schema machinery as we have it. So discovery, OpenAPI, everything works as before. But the actual call to the endpoint then is forwarded. So they are schemas, nothing else.
But how would we guarantee that the endpoint that we're calling speaks to the schema that we've defined?
Oh, this must be guaranteed outside. This is part of the contract.
So
okay,
what we're saying is, if let's say this would be path, root, full, like a separate workspace where potentially these resources are present, everything in that source would have to be this schema compatible.
I think this is already too much implementation detail, right? This is already our specific implementation where we want to reflect from a specific workspace. But in the API export, we probably just want to say, hey, there's a virtual resource, and what is backing that, I think needs to be abstracted.
That's a good question. The discussion, like, how do we want it to be abstracted in a way that it's like outside KCP, outside core, or we want to give ability, let's say, this is one way to do that within the core, potentially saying like there is a separate workspace, potentially even itself, or some virtual workspace or even kube cluster outside.
I mean, I think these, so what we're thinking about, what the specific use case is this like reflecting like one object type into all workspaces, basically, right? And I think that's just one of like potentially several implementations. And I would probably say that this would be a dedicated API object that you create a, I don't know, reflection endpoint or whatever the object is called. It doesn't really matter. But basically, an object that instantiates the like reflection virtual workspace, which is compatible with this virtual resource schema, but it's not something that we would implement into the API export object itself. So what you would...
It could be similar to the mount pattern, right? Where we also have objects which reflect the actual specification.
Yeah, so that's something like that kind resource, basically, like a reference point. And this guy should be implementing a
specific status path.
Serving something like that. Yeah, I like this. And plus it gives us ability to have a contrib virtual workspace, separate, standalone, like object serving this. Okay. Plus anybody else can bring anything else to this one. I think this is extendable enough to be moving forward. Cool.
I'm-
That's a
I'm-
progress.
I mostly still think about the schema thing that Stefan said. Basically, they have to provide a schema. I feel like there's a mismatch there, but I guess we just need to set this up as a contract.
It's a bound resource, and they are backed by schemas. They're just virtual in the sense that there is no etcd behind. I mean, there might be, but it's a virtual API server. I don't think this is a mismatch.
I think it should work. Like, let's say you have external Kubernetes cluster where you want to serve these resources from. You export your CRDs to API schema. You basically configure virtual workspace to do pass-through, and you basically add it here.
And it also helps. I mean, there's an example of a Kubernetes cluster which has pods, and we reflect the pods into a workspace, right? I think in the moment we start to discover and get open API from the other cluster, we are entering the stateful land where aggregated API servers are. Like the aggregator has to keep track of everything and has to merge open API specs. Super slow, it's brittle. If you have schemas which are basically defined here as object as API resource schemas, everything is fixed. If the server goes away, nothing breaks, basically.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this makes sense to me. If I understand correctly, the Kubernetes API aggregation doesn't have this kind of contract, right? It's basically all requests are being kind
It's
of
a
proxied.
complete group which you proxy.
But reality is, like, once we move to this typed thing here, and like I intentionally replace this name with schema, not in like a word name, we can, if time shows that we need something else and the name schema type doesn't work and we really need to extend it, we are flexible at this point, where before we are not. So I don't think, like, let's go with this. It still will require some of the iterations and like proving this working. We have one case, and if the community comes up with something else, some requirements which are strongly backed by the arguments, we can extend it later.
Yeah, no, sounds good. The more I think about it, the more I like it, that we have
Yeah.
a stronger contract than API aggregation.
And just for the recording, this will not be here. This is just basically as a example stuff. It will land in the API endpoint slices. So just as a show example here. Both of these in the long run should not be existing in API Alpha 2. We might even potentially drop this field virtual workspaces when we bump API. If we're bumping this.
Yeah, I would like to drop that if we can.
We have to preserve the data, but we could move it into some annotation just to have it.
Yeah.
But don't show it.
So the way that you're supposed to do it is that you're supposed to create API export endpoint slices, right? And they provide this information. Like this virtual workspace status field, it's been long deprecated, but I think like our controller examples are still offenders of that as well. So we need to rewrite. I know that the docs that I wrote are using the endpoint slices. So there's good information in the docs, but like the code examples, I think are a little out of date. We should maybe fix them before we remove that field.
Yeah, and we will need to change our code examples to there is a PR to be consumer aware. This means we will need to make our patterns aware when the controller should be started and stopped. URL appeared, controller started for the shard, URL goes away, controller stopped. So maybe let's not rush to remove this until we sort out all the soft parts. We can always cut one more API version.
Yeah. Since at some point we'll have to go to beta and then to GA. We have plenty of API migrations in front of us.
Cool. So this basically it. I'm glad we managed to get a quick agreement. So we're gonna slowly move towards implementation this. So you might see some code flying towards this implementation soon. Any other topics? Any open floor questions?
I think I just want to briefly talk about the next release. It's more like of a call to action, I guess. For cutting that release, I think we would still want to do the Kubernetes rebase for the patch version, so not the minor version rebase, which I think is also closing in on getting done. But ideally, hopefully, these like our patches just cleanly apply to the latest 1.31 patch release, and we can use that to cut 0.27, or at least a release candidate of that. I think we still have at least one or two. I think we need to fix the service account lookup as well before we release. But these are, I think, the raise condition fix for API bindings, I think. Also need to get that in. But yeah, these are the three things I would like to see, and then we can cut a release. But yeah, so I'm sure there's much that we can do there, except, continue working on these PRs. And if someone wants to pick up that Kubernetes rebase and that patch rebase, I'll try to get to it as soon as we can.
That's that. If there is that PR for the consumer aware stuff, I fixed most of the questions. Maybe that one could get into, but let's see. Cool. We have quite a few issues which been added to the board. So we've been trying to use issues more again and add stuff in there. Is it worth maybe going through those and assigning, moving them from the new to some more appropriate status?
I'm not sure that makes too much sense. If you see an issue, we have a couple of them are now labeled good first issues. If you are looking for something to pick up, then you could go over them. There's always, we can move them out of new, I guess, MJ, like the thing that we've always been doing. But yeah.
So I can do that offline, but the idea is we started using those more, and now there is way more good first issues out there. So I think it's a call for the people in a community watching recording. If you have spare capacity and to want to join, feel free to pick those up. And if something is not clear, ping us on KCP Dev Kubernetes Slack. So just wanted to share the board for visibility. Cool. Anything else before we stop the recording and give some of the time back to your evenings?
Nothing from my side.
Going once, going twice.